So let's go ahead and open our Bibles, turn to the book of Acts, the 20th chapter. We'll be reading from there shortly. Before we get into our reading, into our reflections on the text, let's bow together in prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day and its blessings. We thank you for the joy that comes within the body of Christ. We hope that the grace that has been given to us is one that we share well. Give us opportunity and courage to do so. Please forgive us of our sins, and we offer this prayer in your Son's name. Amen. There's interesting things that take place in the story of God's people. And there are events that appear in the life of Paul that are seeds, in some ways, that are planted for the future. Our introduction to Paul is one in turmoil. When we first meet Paul, what's he doing? What's the life of Paul at that point?
Persecuting.
Yeah, he's persecuting. He is the hammer for the Sanhedrin and the leading members of upper crust Jerusalem and Israel as they seek to destroy a new divisive group or segment of their community as they see it. And Paul is so militant about it that he takes letters at their kind of agreement to go and persecute Christians elsewhere. He has a high level of animosity to followers of Jesus. What happens next? If we were going to create a couple of quick steps for the life of Paul, the next thing after his persecution of believers is... Right, he meets Jesus in this series of small events that are revealed to us over the course of his life. Some of them are shown immediately in the book of Acts. Some take a little bit longer to play out. We won't see some of them in the text until a little bit later in this story. So now he has an episode with his Lord, and he acknowledges him as Lord. Now, I want to make a quick little note there. The term that Luke uses for Lord in this instance, in what they would be reading from as their Old Testament, and it's pretty much consistent that the Bible that they read from was a Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, so they're reading the Septuagint. Every time your Bible uses a word like Jehovah or Yahweh, or if your translation fits in this basket, it might use a capitalized version of Lord. It's a Greek word that is very consistent in its usage. And when Paul uses it in the book of Acts, and he says, Lord, Lord, who, like that whole conversation, he's using that same word. He is acknowledging this divine creature as God at that moment, in the same way that he would have said it concerning the Father, or God in general, in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, the Septuagint translation of it. So that immediate thing is he goes from, I'm persecuting the followers of this man, Jesus, to, this is God. And so when you see Lord generally used in your New Testament, it's that same Greek word that's used throughout the Old Testament too. So he acknowledges Jesus as God and becomes God's messenger to the Gentiles after that. That moves his life along, but there's a problem relationally that Paul has to go through. He has to be reunited with people who are terrified of him. Because if you're a disciple in the first century and you're walking around Jerusalem and you see Paul coming down the street, what is a reasonable behavior in that context?
Step into the alley where he can't see you.
Yeah, go hide. Or what happens if you're related to Stephen? How do you look at Paul at that point, emotionally and realistically? And that's where the anger button starts to be like, I got two buttons, the hide button, the anger button. And yet, who steps in to connect Paul in that regard? Who solves that problem for him? Barnabas, right?
Barnabas.
Yeah, Barnabas, who becomes known as the son of Encouragement, right? Now, I want you to think backwards. Does the Paul we meet seem like an encourager?
Not at that time.
Because we don't have any evidence to suggest that. He is a destroyer. He is a divider. He is a concretizer. He makes things stuck into the ground and not move. And like, oh, you're staying here with us. But over his time associating with Barnabas, his mission expands a little bit. He is, by God's appointing a messenger to the Gentiles. But he also becomes very involved with encouraging believers. And you see him write about it a lot. So there's a flowering of the personality of Paul that takes place over the course of his life that we're allowed to see. And we don't know if that was already an innate ability or any of those things. We just know that we see it more and more the older he gets and the more mature he gets in his role.
Paul probably was or Saul was probably an encourager to his cause at that time to the others that were afflicting Christians. And that may be one of the things that God saw in him that he said, I've chosen him because got things for him to do. He may have seen that trait in him as being gung-ho for it and encouraging.
Yeah, he's got some sort of ability to drive others towards a destination. And so there is that sense of rallying the cause. But here in Acts chapter 20, there's going to be a small shift where he takes some individual time to encourage these communities of believers who are disconnected in ways that are unique to them from those that are around them, but connected to each other in very special ways. And so our text for this morning is really looking at verses 1 through 16. After the uproar ceased, verse 1, Paul sent for the disciples, and after encouraging them, he said farewell and departed for Macedonia. When he had gone through those regions and had given them much encouragement, he came to Greece. There he spent 3 months, and when a plot was made against him by the Jews as he was about to set sail for Syria, he decided to return through Macedonia. Sopater the Berean, son of Pyrrhus, accompanied him, and of the Thessalonians, Aristarchus and Secundus, and Gaius of Derbe, and Timothy, and the Asians, Tychicus and Trophimus. These went on ahead and were waiting for us at Troas. But we sailed away from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread, and in 5 days we came to them at Troas, where we stayed for 7 days. And so, just a side note, is there anyone else with him in that group that you could discern besides the names that are laid there? There's a pronoun clue if you're going to be detective.
Luke.
Yeah, Luke, we. So when he writes, again, that group pronoun, he's saying, I'm there as well. And so in that setting, we get to see a couple of things that Luke felt was important. And so Luke, who records the persecution phase of his life, now on a kind of a couple of key repetitions, said Paul made it a point to encourage at each one of these steps. And I want to ask a question about that. Why is that vital right now? Why is it now that in the course of this series of events that Paul is seemingly bringing kind of a message of renewal in various senses to the communities of Christians he meets in each of these places? This sets the stage for Acts 7, which is probably a familiar, Acts chapter 20, verse 7, which is a familiar text for us, but I want us to kind of step into it with some background. What's going on in the way in which disciples are treated in the Roman Empire, and more specifically in this conflict between followers of Jesus, followers of the way, individuals who we will call Christians later as we kind of look at the big picture of things, and the broader communities around them? Is there any hints of things coming that might be vital? Les?
As far as the Romans concerned, they didn't care what they believed spiritually as long as they didn't stir up any trouble.
Right, so on the Roman level, there are a couple of issues. As long as there's no conflict in the cities, the Romans, governing authorities really didn't care too much as long as the taxes were paid. So the higher you get the food chain, all they care about is no strife. Except we've already seen a couple of times where in the preaching of Paul, he is being accused of one of two things. He will eventually get accused of preaching about a king other than the Caesar, the ruler of the Roman Empire, and he gets accused of preaching about another god in a place where that would be a capital crime. And so these things started bouncing off this. As well, there's no trouble. But we see even in this narrative here, verses 1 through 6, the Jews don't like what Paul is doing for any number of reasons. Not always specified for us, but they're not happy with it. And so their solution is very old Paul. We know how to fix this problem. In fact, this guy was good at it, right? And their solution is basically just if he's not here, then the problem will vanish. His followers are his followers. They're not following anything else. And they'll be gone. And we see some of that. So that's a conflict on a couple of levels where there's starting to be conflict with the Roman Empire. And that will rise. It will intensify to a high degree to the point at which people we read of in the scriptures, specifically Polycarp, will be noted as put to death because of his beliefs in a very public fashion. Polycarp would eventually be sent to Rome to be executed in public and be forced to answer the question, denounce your God and your king and live or die. And he has a long speech or soliloquy that's recorded from history in regards to his defense of his belief. And so that's going to eventually put the pressure on these events. And in some ways, Paul becomes the forerunner of that, which again is another one of those cycles where he himself was a persecutor and he dies the death of the martyr as a disciple of Jesus. All right, so let's talk about this familiar section of text. We're going to talk about verses 7 through 16 for a little bit. Then we'll actually read them together and kind of see what's going on there. If someone in this audience, and I'm looking at everybody, I think you've got a background that would look at this way. When's the most common time that we read Acts chapter 20 and verse 7? What's the honest answer to that?
When we teach someone will need to assemble on the first day of the week.
Right, so either we're talking about the primacy or the major importance of being together on the first day of the week, or there's two secondary things that tie into that. What's the first one? Taking the Lord's Supper. And then we also have to discuss what do they mean by this phrase, breaking bread. I think that's probably like this, the last two orders of things. But I want you to think about, in this particular passage, is that the primary reason that you think Luke included this phrase? Is he trying to create a checkbook answer to a question about worship practices? Is that how it reads to you? Like, does he have this like introduction? Goes, and theologically speaking, in the next 1,000 years, we're going to need to argue about how Christians need to worship together. That's not what he's doing there. Now, that doesn't mean that our use of the text is inappropriate. What it means is we have to be careful students of the Scriptures and know with what we have. We have a narrative that is telling us what takes place. We have to be careful then to recognize that it's not, we would say like a direct command or a command or a commandment. It's a narrative. And saying these are what disciples did. Now, doesn't mean it's no less authoritative or valuable than other types of commands in those contexts when we have more information about it. when we have some greater context and some greater appreciation of what's going on. But it also may inform us that when we're reading this passage and we have one goal, we want to use it like we always tend to use it, to kind of establish that truth in our minds. Think about it this way. You ever notice on the road, if you're looking for a certain kind of car, eventually those are the only kind of cars you see? Like, yeah, I think I just saw a Ford truck. It was a Ford F-150 four-door. Now, I'm guaranteeing success that I'm going to prime your brains to see a bunch of Ford F-150s after services when you're driving on the road for two reasons. One, is the most common truck that's on the road right now. And two, I've told you to go look for them. That happens with our reading of the Bible. We can miss details unintentionally when we focus on what we believe the answer is already. So now, with all that big wording, in a second we're going to read the text itself, but are there any other observations before we start reading? Because we already preloaded ourselves with some presuppositions.
So I read this as one of the days while they were there, right? So it's just, he's saying, hey, we're here for it took us 5 days to get there. We stayed for 7 days. And then during that time, this is what happened.
Yeah. It's like it says they were there for 7 days. He says, but in the midst of the 7 days, on the first day of the week, and note it doesn't say the Greek construction for Sunday. They have words to say Sunday. They say first day of the week. We are forced to negotiate with the text and recognize that the first day of the week is Sunday. They actually have ordinal definitions in the language, if that's what they wanted to do. Luke is not concerned with the level of detail that we want to solve our problems. He is concerned with doing that combination of inspiration and perspiration that gives us this story. So let's do this. Les, could you read verses 7 through 12? And Justin, do you want to read for us this morning? Are you ready to go? Verses 13 through 16.
On the first day of the week, when we were gathered together to break bread, Paul talked with them, intending to depart the next day, and he prolonged his speech until midnight. There were many lamps in the upper room where we were gathered, and a young man named Eutychus, sitting at the window, sank into a deep sleep, as Paul talked still longer. And being overcome by sleep, he fell down from the third story and was taken up dead. But Paul went down, bent over him, and taking him in his arms, said, "Do not be alarmed, for his life is in him." And when Paul had gone up and had broken bread and eaten, he conversed with them a long while until daybreak, and so departed. And they took the youth away alive, and were not a little comforted.
But going ahead to the ship, we set sail for Assos, intending to take Paul aboard there. For so he had arranged, intending himself to go by land. And when he met us at Assos, we took him on board and went to Middleton. And sailing from there, we came the following day opposite Chios. The next day we touched at Samos, and the day after that we went to Miletus. For Paul had decided to sail past Ephesus, so that he might not have to spend time in Asia, for he was hastening to be at Jerusalem, if possible, on the day of Pentecost.
All right, so let's think about some things. Starting with the first part of this telling, what do you think is going on in the community of disciples on this first day of the week that results in Paul's message being prolonged, delayed, or continued? There's all three of those things are kind of true about the grammar that's going on here until midnight. What's the context that might help you figure some things? Are there any clues from history or from your reading of a text that gives us some setup for what's taking place here? Rich?
So we see him spending time encouraging as he goes about traveling. I guess a lot of times this verse is used to keep preachers' sermons short, right?
For safety. Safety reasons.
Safety purposes.
Yeah.
But the other thing is that Paul is speaking and he is encouraging, and I think that I would probably have the same reaction if I'm learning something new and I'm excited about it. And I continue to hear more and more and more. So for me, when you're excited about something and you're talking about something, it doesn't matter what the time is.
Yeah. Anything else?
I think it may have something to do with the length of his lesson about him, the fact that he was departing on the next day, and he had a lot he wanted to say to us.
That's a preacher standard right there. We always got stuff to say. Not sure it's worth much, but we always have a lot to say. This one is inspired, and so we'll give him a double dose of opportunity. So yeah, there's a length of message to that as well. Keep this in mind. This is the Roman context, not American post-unionized colonial world, where we've institutionalized the idea that weekends are not what? Workdays, right? We've made that actually a point of law in some contexts, where we have state and federal rules regarding hours of employment. And so, though I do not think this actually exists in the real world anymore, what is a technical full-time hour obligation for a job? 40 hours, right? It's a 40-hour length. Is that realistic? How many people you know who have non-hourly jobs that actually only work 40 hours a week? I don't know very many of them. I'm sure it exists. Like, I'm sure there's someplace. Most folks who have full-time jobs that aren't on the clock, you clock in, you clock out, you work more. And those who are hourly, and this is my encouragement to you, never shortchange yourself. When you get to work, clock yourself in. And you clock out when you get out. Like, that's kind of how these things work. You're working, you get paid for your work. But first century, there's no official holiday on the first day of the week. It's no cultural context where you're not expected to be at work on Sunday. And the Bible tells us, both the Bible and a lot of history, who were disciples in the first century? Were they the rich, the powerful, and the moneyed? No. What does it say? Now, there were some who had money and had jobs, most certainly. They're identified. But the bulk of them were the poor, slaves. Do slaves get to pick when they work? Yeah. The number actually escapes my head. I was about to quote it, but then I realized my quotation in my head was not exact, so I'm not going to quote it. But a good portion of the Roman Empire were enslaved to some degree. Whether they were captured servants or impoverished individuals working off of debt and slavery, a large contingent of the Roman Empire that were slaves. And slaves worked every day. History tells us then that in the first century, and as this continued to move through this region, worship among Christians took place when they could. And so another factor describing what's going on here is to realize that these assemblies are done at night because of convenience, when they could no longer do their job. And so while we have the privilege and opportunity to get up early and have our morning routine and come to worship in a kind of shady side, sunny side building context, nearly all Christians in the first century, at least in this part of the empire, were meeting in the evening. And so this assembly starts after everyone has had a full day's work, men and women. And it goes till midnight. So you have a lot going on that kind of shapes our understanding of that. And nowhere in the scriptures nor in history does it suggest that this meeting is done at night for protection at this point. They're not hiding. What they're doing is assembling, which also connects to our ideas of encouragement. Because if you have a lot to say and it's super important, you want everyone there. So you're going to prolong, extend, or delay your message until the people you need to go here. It also explains Eutychus. Because it's not saying like Paul's sermon was so boring or so long that he couldn't pay attention. It doesn't say that. It says he fell asleep. I'll ask this question as one who has been in the same spot before when I was working a couple jobs and preaching. How many of you have struggled and failed to keep your eyes open during a worship on Sunday because of work you had to do around your services? If you didn't raise your hand, because I gave you both options, struggled and failed, and those eyes kind of dropped down like, I've struggled and I've failed. And somebody who loves you goes, yeah. Especially, like the whole gamut of possibilities there. So we've all been in that position. It's not a thing where you're like, oh, I've never. We've all been there. All right? So that's what's going on. That shows us the structure. And note, none of that has to do specifically with that day, because that's every day in their culture. But Paul has done this on the first day of the week for a reason, for any number of reasons. And so this becomes important and also shows itself elsewhere in a couple other ways. And there's good theological reasons that the first day of the week like this is important. He'll talk about that in other places that support this idea. So then we have Eutychus. Side note, never, ever, ever call out someone who is sleeping in your preaching or teaching and call them Eutychus. While they may laugh heartily about it, their mother or father may not find it as funny as you and he think it is. And I'm saying that from experience, and so I'm offering that wisdom to you. Mama is not going to play if you call out their child in public, even though the adult child laughed incessantly about it. But this is a little more serious, right? But it also then serves the general purpose of what a miracle can do. The miracles we had seen in the chapters before this are so poignant through the work of Paul that people are taking handkerchiefs, pieces of cloth that had been in contact with him and sharing with others. This one's just very personal. And is Eutychus less because of this? No, he too is just a man. And nor is he more because of this. Don't be alarmed, he's alive, is the broad statement. He then goes on, and this is Luke again pulling up the circumstances and begins to continue to identify for us all of the particular next steps that take place. And so the small little segment, verses 7 through 12, include for us an example of Christians together on the first day of the week. A couple of practices together on the first day of the week. And it's a little bit unique in the scriptures, is that it's one of the few positive illustrations of it. In the letters to the church at Corinth, it's almost negative corrected. That is, there are things going on in their assemblies involving the breaking of bread together and the communion concerning Jesus that have to be fixed. So that's a negative example with positive reinforcement and redirection. Well, this one's positive. And there's no real redirection necessary here. Also, of note to think about this on the theological side, at times people will suggest any number of things concerning what this breaking of bread and observance of a Lord's Supper should look like, and it's suggested that it would be akin to a potluck. And note that that's exactly what kind of gets pushed back against in Paul's letter. That, hey, it's not a potluck. And in fact, those of you who have lots are withholding it from those who have none. And so what's Paul's instruction to the Christians who were kind of lording it over the poor people in their congregation because they had more stuff to gather with? It says, do what with it?
They were sinning.
Well, he uses sin because of their attitudes, but the practice is corrected by going, go eat at home. Take that at home. And there's some great cultural illustrations in the first century at Corinth as to why this kind of abuse was normalized in their culture, and Paul was destroying it. And so he was helping them understand that they are now brothers and sisters in Christ, and their behavior should be communal rather than hoity-toity at the top of the tables, and you poor people, you're in the little common space down here. You have none of our goods. And so he corrects it very strongly by saying, worry about eating at home. Worry about the Lord when you come together. And treat each other as brethren. And you see that here too. In this context here, you'll notice that there is no sense in the story, the very brief story here, of class division and distinctions between who's who and what's what. And in fact, they accommodate those who would be of the lowest class because of the time in which they meet. Going at a time which would favor the slave and disfavor the rich. Because it would be weird for the rich to be out and associating with slaves to begin with, but now even more so. to be engaged in communal activity with them. There's a lot of stuff that goes on in there. All right, so that's kind of a quick run through of the reading. What are some observations now that we've read it again? We've added some context. What are some observations that you have about what you see here? Things that you think are important for us to recognize? Things that are of value in this particular part of the life of Paul. Standard method of either raising your hand or interjecting applies. And so you can either just speak up or you can interact with the hand raise too. They both work.
I'm going to look for a little bit more clarification on the breaking of bread.
Absolutely, sure.
And how is it that we come to the conclusion that this is actually remembering Christ in a communal type of way? Because what we read is breaking of bread. We read a little bit about it in Acts chapter 2 as well, where they were gathered together after Pentecost and breaking bread and those types of things. So help me come to the conclusion that this is partaking in unleavened bread and juice, remembering Christ.
All right, so there's a couple of ways we can get there. Like there's different routes to get to the same destination in all things. And so if I'm going to drive to Les's house from here, I can go straight there or I can go through Noonan, right? And I'll eventually get to Les's house. So we're going to go to Noonan first. So that should be no surprise. So that's asking questions of like, what do disciples have instruction to do? What are they told to do? Well, we go to Noonan. We use our illustration because we're going to Les's house. We need to get something in Noonan first. Our like directions or our instructions, or maybe we have to pick something up at the store there. Are there any direct tellings, clear statements where God says to the disciples, you need to do something? So this is how we're going to get to Noonan, or get to Les's house from Noonan. So yes, they are. You have commands from both Jesus and then reiterated by Paul in the letter to the church at Corinth, that he restates, the Lord Jesus revealed to me. He said to me that we need to do this. And so we know from that point that there is an expectation of a communion, a communal gathering that would emphasize the risen, resurrected Lord as connected to his death, that we call the Lord's Supper. It's got a lot of different historical names, but for our purposes right now, we're just going to say it's the Lord's Supper. But you can call it any of those biblical phrases and even use some of the Latin into English ones. If you want to call it the Eucharist, that's actually fine in that sense, as long as you understand what you're using. It's not the high church practice of the Eucharist. You're just using the word. But we're going to use Lord's Supper, okay? So basically, Paul says you got to do this. So now we have a telling. We have a few more. You have the telling of Jesus that occurs in the Gospels. It says, I will do this with you again, and you will keep it as a remembrance to me. So now we have two tellings of them expecting to do this. That then says, okay, we got enough to go on to know that we should look for disciples doing. Like, so we're in Noonan, and we need to get to where they're doing it. So let's drive over to Les's house, because that's where the thing's going to happen. And now we have to ask the question, what do we see about that? Well, we've got one that takes place in Acts chapter 2 that seems to have this phrase, where disciples are together, they're doing a thing, but it's not as distinct. Because the one in Acts chapter 2 doesn't have any time constraints on it as to when. And it seems that the instruction that Paul gives back in our Corinthian letter context, he says, when you come together to break bread. And he says, there's a caveat that takes place in one of the verses, as a church. It's translated church. It's the Greek word that we get all of our church translations from, ecclesia, when you come together as a church. So that gives it a level of specificity that's a little higher than I can do it all the time. So now you're going, okay, now I'm looking for Christians who are gathered together as a community of believers, as a church, as a called out group of disciples. You're saying, what are they doing? Well, because in that same time we were in Noonan, we noted that, hey, this really shouldn't be a common meal And it certainly shouldn't be a common meal where those who have a lot of money put down those who have no money. But it also just really is like, this is not a common meal thing. There's something special about it. We come to this showing and say, they're breaking bread. When you go back to the reading of the telling of Jesus, they broke bread there. And it's kind of distinct from the meal of the Passover. It's at the end of it where he passed the bread. That's how we get to that. We've gone to Noonan, we had a long way, and now we got back to this breaking of bread is a representation of what we understand a command or a telling to be. And now they're showing or giving us an example of that telling. And so that's route number one. Wes?
And the fact that it's on the first day of the week is another thing.
Right.
Because we have other scriptures that tell us what first century Christians did on the first day of the week.
Right, and we can go to one of our same group of letters, the Corinthian correspondence, and say, hey, they always are. It says when they come together on the first day of the week, you do lay by and store. The implication from that, so we have a tell, a show, an imply, or a command, an example, a necessary inference. Those are the same concepts, but different ways to express them. You get that inference side of them being together on the first day of the week. It's like, that seems like a habit. And we imply the habits of regular assembly from that text. And so now we can have all of that laid out, and we come to the conclusion, go, okay, this breaking of bread, which is a semi-generic phrase. It is not a religious magic word. We've got to realize that our Bible isn't like loaded with special poison words that can kill bad things and special healing words that can fix bad things and make them good. They're just communication. And so all of these words do have some usage, and some are religiously typically used. But breaking of bread isn't necessarily that. We have to use context to help us figure out what's going on. So the context has now loaded us up to bear and said, all right, point number one, they have commands or tellings. Point number two, this is a showing of it. So we make the inference that this breaking of bread has to match what Jesus was doing, which is why we used a variation of unleavened bread and a variation of unleavened or unfermented grape, because it matches what we would expect to have taken place there. Realize, though, that our unleavened bread is not necessarily first century unleavened bread. It is just unleavened bread. And it's fine either way. And there's ways you can end up at unleavened bread and still have the outcome we're looking for. And we use commercialized, grape juice. That's a relatively modern opportunity. It's actually a Methodist minister who created the grape juice we use during the conflicts over Prohibition as a way to give an option for those who wanted to make sure with their consciences that what they were drinking had no chance of being past a certain stage in the leavening process. If you go overseas, just as a warning, in many of the countries that you go into, the fruit of the vine that's served there is not Welch's. And even if it is, it's been in the cabinet for a long time. And so just realize that what you're getting is not what you're used to. So you just have to prepare yourself ahead of time. So that gives us a roundabout. In a more narrow sense, there's a lot of good writing that suggests that the use of this tends to be exclusive in Christian writing to refer to the Lord's Supper. And so when you read first century, second century, third century disciples who would go basically from Polycarp forward, they use this phrase, breaking of bread, often to refer to the Lord's Supper, though not exclusively. So they read it that way. And that's really important because a snapshot of how a word is used at a certain time is as important as the other factors that surround it. That tells us how that word was functioning. An example of that is to think through your life on the word gay. How many different ways has the word gay been used since you were a child? A lot, right? Especially at my age bracket, I don't recall, as a child, it was used often in literature that I would read in the way it's classically used, happy. And then gradually it got adopted into other uses. Give it time. It'll swirl around again. Words do that. They will initially, they'll be adopted, they'll be trashed, they'll be picked out of the garbage and used in a new way. Because word usage at the snapshot can matter more than the way in which people used it before then or otherwise. Does that answer the bulk of the questions you had, Rich, underneath that?
Yeah, no, I think that's good because it helps us to understand when we're explaining that to someone who probably hasn't been exposed to what we're doing.
Yeah.
And they're like, why are you doing that? So when you go through those verses, you're like, well, they're breaking bread. And then you've got later on where Paul, after the guy fell down, then he broke bread again, and then he departed. So it just kind of helps us put it in together with all of the other verses, and I think Corinthians really helps us kind of nail that down as to what they're doing during the worship service.
Right, and it's a very, the thing we also can be helped by recognizing is amongst all individuals who claim to follow Jesus from the first century forward, it's fairly normalized that this phrase is referring to the observance of the Lord's Supper. It is uncommon to try to pull it somewhere else and to stretch it. Now, that doesn't mean the disciples of various areas didn't stretch it. They had other ways of accommodating their various practices. If they wanted to turn it into a monthly thing, they find a way, and they did. It doesn't mean they're using the text to get there. It just means that's what they did. And those are two very different things. Because I can go and read, as an example and an illustration, there's a ton of literature that suggests that during the 500 to 800s, there were a lot of public preachers who were women. Tons of them. Not to the overabundance of the male ones, but that doesn't answer the textual issues. It just means that there were women who were preaching at that time in public. And so what that answers is, did people do it? It doesn't answer why or whether it was balanced on the scriptures. The same thing is true. I can find a whole lot of even more evidence that says there were a lot of male preaching opportunities in the 5th to the 800, like 500s, 800s range. Still doesn't answer the same question as to who should be doing the job. It just means that those people did that. And it's one of the other things you lay on the table to figure all of these various things out. All right. So that brings us back to our, we got 2 minutes, so we get at least to get one or two of those. In this particular section of the text, all the way from verse 1 to 16, is there anything you liked or didn't like going on here?
One thing that I liked, it didn't matter how busy Paul and his temple were, they took time out to assemble on the first day of the week with other Christians. So that tells me that this was something important. They were traveling all around the country, but they took time out to find a group of Christians that was assembling on the first day of the week.
Yeah, there's certainly a high priority on the togetherness aspect of this. What else? Anything else that's in the like, don't like category? Or things you have questions about? Mystery is always abound for me. I really like the fact that Paul's message was one on encouragement. I think that is a development of his person. It shows us a wholer picture of Paul than we got to see before. And I would credit it, potentially like Les pointed out, to aspects of his rally the cause mindset that could have been there, but also his time with Barnabas. You eventually become the average of the people you spend the most of your time with. And he spent a lot of time with Barnabas. And he eventually becomes even more like him when he's willing to accept people who had let him down in the past and call them necessary and essential in the future. That's it for our time, so I'll stop right there. But we'll be continuing in our study of the book of Acts next Sunday. Thanks, everybody.